Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents We the Presidents, How American Presidents Shaped the Last Century, 2nd edition, by Ronald Gruner. Narrated by Tom Parks. Introduction. I never expected to write a presidential history. For nearly 50 years, my life has been consumed by high technology, starting as a computer engineer in 1969 and ending as the CEO of a data analytics company in 2015. In between, I co-founded and served as the CEO of two pioneering technology firms in high-performance computing and the Internet. As a technologist, I needed to look forward, not backward as historians must. I had little time or interest for politics. Except for one New Hampshire town hall meeting in 1976 where Ronald Reagan spoke, and a brief meet and greet for Barack Obama more than 30 years later, I had never attended a political event. Although I voted in every presidential election since 1968, I voted for the man and not the party, a sentiment heard more often in the past than today. But my interest in political history, and particularly presidential history, was piqued in 2015, the year I retired. It was a period when American politics was transitioning from merely polarized to openly tribal. America had become deeply divided over economic, cultural, and ideological issues. Sadly, many Americans seemed to be shifting their loyalties from their country to their political party. The idea that there were two Americas, one blue and one red, had become, if not yet entrenched, a common theme. On the blue side were socialists who hated America, and on the red side, deplorables who clung to their guns and religion. How had so many Americans come to despise each other? I had grown up and attended school in Oklahoma, a deeply red state, and then followed my career to Massachusetts, one of the bluest of the blue states, where I lived and worked for 40 years. Great universities and hospitals largely defined Boston, while oil, cattle, and farming dominated Ponca City, my birthplace. Sure, they were vastly different, but nothing, then or now, to justify the antipathy so many today feel against their fellow Americans. So, what was cleaving America apart? President George Washington struggled with that question over 200 years ago. Two political parties had already emerged early in his presidency. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party, which supported a strong federal government, and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party, which supported states' rights. The two men and their embryonic parties were bitterly divided. Distressed by the division, Washington, in nearly identical letters to Hamilton and Jefferson, pleaded, "How unfortunate and how much it is to be regretted that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissensions should be harrowing and tearing our vitals." Washington's appeal for moderation were unsuccessful. Political parties had firmly established themselves as part of the political fabric of America. Washington reluctantly accepted their emergence and in his 1796 farewell address took care to warn future Americans of their destructive nature. The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of political parties are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. President Washington could not have been more prescient. America in 2015 had become agitated by false claims, consumed by animosity, even hatred of political opponents, and soon would be threatened by riots and insurrection. The animosity between Hamilton and Jefferson, admittedly, was as much personal as political. But today, politics have metastasized far beyond two strong-willed individuals. Politics has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, composed of partisan news organizations, firebrand media pundits, subversive internet sites, avaricious political action committees, and sponsored think tanks and universities. It is the American political industry that has divided America. Like any profit-driven industry, its constituents have partitioned America into target markets that are then assiduously cultivated. As a result, much of the nation's news media, driven by profits and subdivided by political ideology, has become overtly politicized, forcing Americans to select their news sources based on their political views. But don't blame the viewer. It's human nature that most people are more comfortable with information that confirms rather than challenges their existing point of view. The unfortunate result is that two Americans could watch Fox News and MSNBC, for example, and form completely different judgments regarding the national news that day, accepting their preferred source as unadulterated truth and rejecting the other as biased misrepresentations. Then, after the evening news, political commentators, rather than broaden perspectives, hammer home their own narrow ideological worldview. Contributing to this sorry mix are assorted foreign actors, ranging from common grifters to the Russian Internet Research Agency, spreading their own disinformation and dissension across America. This politicization extends beyond the media into think tanks and universities, where unabashed experts are paid to promote the economic and political ideology of their sponsors. Where once Americans had a reasonably unified view of their shared history, today's history is filtered through differing political lenses. But no two presidents have been more villainized and more extolled than Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So, not coincidentally, it was in 2017, the year the American presidency transitioned from Obama to Trump, that I decided to write this book. It was also a notable year for me personally, that of my 70th birthday, and a year of reflection. Fortunately, researching and writing a book today, even on a complex subject, is not as difficult as might be expected. I found that particularly true writing a presidential history. Unlike even a few years ago, the historical archives held by presidential libraries, the White House, Department of State, and scores of other governmental agencies are online and easily searchable. Research that formerly took days and often numerous trips to a distant library today can be conducted comfortably in a few hours online. And certainly, my technical career, consumed with assembling and objectively interpreting facts, helped. I've taken an unusual approach in writing a presidential history. We the Presidents is completely devoid of politics. Never discussed are the political battles and intrigue that occupy many presidential biographies. Nor will you find, except in a few quotations, the words Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, left or right. For many Americans, these labels have become divisive, even pejorative. Their mere mention tends to bias the discussion. Another difference is that the book is more quantitative than most presidential biographies. The key criterion of a successful presidency is not political battles won, but rather the well-being and prosperity of ordinary citizens. For most Americans, that's closely related to their pocketbooks. So throughout this book are discussions covering economic growth, personal income and income inequality, taxation, and other related topics. You'll also find numerous digressions discussing how disparate events from Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to the financial panic of 1907 to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 have altered history and shaped America in the process. Finally, I have striven to present verifiable facts rather than opinion, and then respected the listener to form their own judgments. Of course, there are many outstanding presidential biographies written by professional historians, more than a few of which are Pulitzer Prize winners. This book, of course, does not approach their well-crafted work. But most professional biographies focus in depth on a single president over a relatively small span of time, typically a few years enveloping the president's lifetime. Rather, my contribution, if any, is that I've concentrated on how American presidents over the last 100 years, from Warren G. Harding to Donald Trump, have shaped today's issues: immigration, healthcare, civil rights, tax and fiscal policies, income distribution, globalization, and the proper role of democratic government. Every generation, including ours, tends to believe they live in unique times. But these issues all had their roots in earlier presidencies, their branches extending into succeeding presidencies and ultimately to today. Had President Warren G. Harding, for example, not selected Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary, Mellon likely would not have written his 1924 book, Taxation: The People's Business, a book that motivated Ronald Reagan's economic policies and today forms the basis of modern supply-side economics. Had President Jimmy Carter not put the nation on a path of energy conservation, America would not have reached energy independence 40 years later. Had President Bill Clinton discouraged rather than encouraged NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia today might be a close ally, as Germany and Japan are, rather than an adversary. It's the intertwined threads of history, rippling upward to today, that have woven the intricate tableau that is America. This book tells a small part of that story. Ronald Gruner, October 1st, 2021. Prologue. The years leading up to the presidency of Warren G. Harding in 1921 were an era of political and social reform, a progressive period in which reformers sought to curtail unfair and corrupt business practices, provide protections for workers and consumers, and expand civil rights. It was also a period during which traditional white Anglo-Saxon Americans renewed their resistance to the nation's growing racial diversity. The progressive era had its roots after the Civil War, with the rise of a new class of American entrepreneurs, men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan. These ambitious and visionary business leaders built America's oil and steel industries, railroads, and major banks. Carnegie Steel Company smelted the steel to build towering skyscrapers and lay rails across America. Rockefeller Standard Oil refined kerosene to light the nation and later gasoline to power millions of automobiles. Vanderbilt's railroads interconnected the nation, from its great cities to its remote villages. Morgan's Wall Street empire financed much of America's expansion. In less than half a century, laissez-faire capitalism had propelled the U.S. economy past every European country and made its adherents fabulously rich. But American workers were languishing. Working 10-hour days, 6 days a week, their average pay adjusted for inflation had stagnated from 1890 through 1920. With labor so cheap, owners valued their workers little more than the machinery in their factories, mines, and mills. Working conditions were often horrendous and dangerous. Not surprisingly, it was a period of great labor unrest. In 1892, workers at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead, Pennsylvania steel mill went on strike protesting working conditions. Carnegie responded by calling in 300 Pinkerton agents. 16 men died in the ensuing confrontation. The violent Homestead strike hardened the positions of both owners and workers. Over the next 30 years, armed battles between labor and management grew more frequent and more violent, culminating with the Battle of Blair Mountain in August 1921, 5 months after President Harding took office. The battle, the largest armed insurrection since the Civil War, pitted 10,000 West Virginia coal miners against 3,000 lawmen and strikebreakers. As many as 100 men died in the fighting. The poor working conditions in steel mills and mines weren't unique. On March 25, 1911, one of the nation's most tragic industrial disasters struck the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. A shirtwaist was a popular woman's dress with a seam at the waist and a bodice incorporating a collar and buttons similar to a man's shirt. The factory was located on the upper floors of the 10-story Ash Building in Greenwich Village. 500 workers, largely young immigrant women, were crowded together cutting and sewing garments. With no sprinkler system and surrounded by flammable cloth scraps, their workplace was a fire trap. The conflagration killed 146 workers, 62 of whom chose to jump to their deaths. It wasn't just workers who were affected by lax and unsafe working conditions. Unwitting consumers were also victims. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, describing the appalling meat-packing plants in the Chicago stockyards. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, and so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. Cartload after cartload of it would be taken up and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and sent out to the public's breakfast. Sinclair's graphic descriptions of the packing plants shocked Americans, and caused many, no doubt, to push their breakfast sausage aside. Other writers, known as muckrakers, exposed child labor, fraudulent medicines, price-fixing, rampant pollution, political corruption, and other abuses. In 1901, Vice President Teddy Roosevelt became president after President William McKinley was assassinated by an unemployed steelworker. For the next 12 years, Roosevelt and his hand-picked successor President William Howard Taft pursued a progressive agenda dismembering monopolies and regulating business practices. In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of the Northern Securities Company, a railroad trust which controlled 3 major railroads. In 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act to assure products met minimal purity and safety standards. In 1911, the Supreme Court found Standard Oil of New Jersey guilty of monopolizing the petroleum industry and ordered its breakup. That same year, the court ordered the American Tobacco Company to be split into 4 competing tobacco companies. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act prohibited anti-competitive mergers, predatory pricing, while also legalizing lawsuits against companies and upholding the rights of labor to organize. In 1913, Congress established the Federal Reserve as the nation's central bank. 6 years earlier, the nation's banking system had nearly collapsed during the Panic of 1907. It would have, except for the private efforts by J.P. Morgan and his wealthy friends, who provided hundreds of millions in personal funds to bail out banks, the stock exchange, and even New York City. The reforms reached even to the American Constitution. 4 constitutional amendments were passed during the Progressive Era. To finance a growing federal government, the 16th Amendment established a federal income tax. The 17th Amendment replaced the legislative appointment of U.S. senators with public elections. The 18th Amendment prohibited the sale of alcoholic beverages, but not their consumption. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The Progressive Era marked the beginning of today's activist federal government. As America transitioned from an agrarian to an industrial society, Americans became increasingly dependent on others for their food, clothing, housing, and livelihood. Progressive Era reforms helped assure American workers and consumers shared in America's growing prosperity, but they were given a square deal, as President Teddy Roosevelt labeled his progressive agenda. Roosevelt's progressive square deal would be followed 30 years later by President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and then, 20 years after that, by President Harry Truman's Fair Deal. Understandably, America's oligarchs at the time weren't particularly pleased with Teddy Roosevelt's progressive politics. As the former President Teddy Roosevelt was leaving for an African safari, financier J.P. Morgan famously quipped, "America expects that every lion will do its duty." The years overlapping the Progressive Era had a dark side: the strong resurgence of what today is known as white supremacy. In 1902, Woodrow Wilson, then a professor at Princeton University, published his monumental A History of the American People. Southern white men, Wilson wrote, suffered under the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes, and pronounced the Ku Klux Klan an invisible empire of the South bound together in loose organization to protect the Southern country from some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution. A decade later, Wilson, now the nation's 28th president, was disturbed to find the federal government largely integrated. In 1913, the government was one of the few American institutions providing advancement opportunities for African Americans. Wilson changed that. Shortly after taking office, Wilson ordered the segregation of federal facilities, basing his order on the need to reduce racial tensions. When black journalist William Monroe Trotter, during an Oval Office meeting, argued that black and white federal workers had worked together peacefully for 50 years, Wilson had Trotter escorted from the White House. But it was a movie that most influenced America's race relations for a generation or more. The movie, The Birth of a Nation, was based on The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan, a book written by one of Wilson's former classmates. The 1915 film depicts two families, one Northern and one Southern, in the years surrounding the Civil War. Although a huge commercial success, the film is profoundly racist in its portrayal of African Americans as brutish, lazy, morally degenerate, and dangerous. The film helped inspire the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, a secretive, racist organization founded in 1865 by Confederate veterans, but had gone dormant after a Supreme Court decision declared the Klan unconstitutional in 1882. Racial discrimination, though, had spread beyond discrimination only against African Americans. In 1906, San Francisco ordered all Asian children to be placed in separate, segregated schools. President Teddy Roosevelt persuaded the city's school board to rescind the order. In return, Roosevelt asked Japan to sign the Gentleman's Agreement, in which Japan promised to deny passports to its citizens wishing to work in the United States. A sullen Japan complied. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, largely Catholics and Jews, were also declared a threat to American homogeneity. In 1911, a congressional commission headed by Senator William P. Dillingham concluded, "The heavy Southern and Eastern European immigration of recent years had posed a serious danger to American society by bringing in large numbers of people who were dramatically different from the older stock of European Americans and who could not be assimilated. The Commission's conclusions contributed to the Immigration Act of 1917, which, among other restrictive provisions, created a barred zone from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, from which no immigrants were allowed to enter. In August 1914, Europe erupted into war after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the presumptive heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. President Wilson was determined that the United States stay out of the distant European conflict. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine sank the RMS Lusitania, killing 1,195 people, including 128 Americans. 3 months later, a German sub sank the SS Arabic, a British ocean liner bound for the United States. Wilson still resisted calls for the United States to enter the war. In January 1917, British intelligence decoded an incredible telegram sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. The telegram proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico, suggesting that the two countries make war together, make peace together, while also offering generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Yet Wilson refused to declare war on Germany. It was only after Germany instituted unlimited submarine warfare across the Atlantic Ocean that the United States, on April 6, 1917, declared war on Germany. Wilson promised the war would be a war to end all wars and would make the world safe for democracy. During the short 18 months that America fought in Europe, 117,000 American soldiers died in brutal trench warfare. In early 1918, Wilson presented his 14-points plan to assure a peaceful transition after the war. One of his points led to the establishment of the League of Nations, a general association of nations to mediate international disputes. But Americans wanted no involvement in a post-war Europe. The United States had resisted entering the European war until continuing to do so became impossible. Now, Britain and France, rather than building a lasting peace, demanded punitive concessions from a defeated and humiliated Germany, thus sowing the seeds for the Second World War. Then, as the war was ending, a virulent new strain of influenza, the Spanish flu, began to indiscriminately kill people at rates far higher than the war. Lacking vaccines and antibiotics, by 1920, an estimated 50 million people had died throughout the world, including 675,000 Americans. Throughout the pandemic, health officials struggled to convince the public to practice good hygiene, limit social gatherings, and wear face masks. The public revolted over seemingly arbitrary public gathering bans where theaters might be open but churches closed. In much of America, though, face masks gained considerable popularity as an emblem of public spiritedness. Still, many resisted the masks, even within the public health community. One notable critic was the Detroit Health Commissioner Dr. J.W. Inches, who declared, "These masks are worthless. A mosquito could jump through them." A century later, during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, similar issues would divide Americans. By summer 1919, the pandemic had run its course. In just 2 years, the nation had lost nearly 800,000 Americans to the First World War and Spanish flu, nearly double the lives that would be lost during the forthcoming Second World War. In 1920, Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding ran for president. Harding sensed the weariness wrought by the political activism of the Progressive era and the suffering inflicted by the First World War and Spanish flu. America's present need, Harding declared, is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, Not revolution, but restoration. Warren G. Harding.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?